So back in January, I was scrolling Reddit as you do, right? And this post came up on Bitcoin by a user called CHCON. Now, he just finished developing his own homemade encryption software to be used for passing down secrets to people in the future. And it would ask you a password and a series of questions and answers to ascertain that you're the right person for this lockbox. And it would check what the time is, and it would only give you the file if the time and everything else matched. I thought this was pretty intriguing. Most encryption products out there don't implement time locks, and when you have a think about it, you can influence the time in so many different ways, right? They actually kind of thought it was impossible, so I was like, okay, let's have a look. CHCON was pretty happy with the software, and he goes to claim that it's unhackable, right? It has an unhackable time lock synced to the Bitcoin network, whatever that means, right? And he was so confident in his technology that he made a challenge lockbox, filled it with a private key for 0.02 Bitcoin, and asked people to try and hack it. And I was just like, that's just icing on top, right? Homemade encryption plus Bitcoin, let's give this a go. So looking at his website, he gives us, for this particular challenge lockbox, the password, which is TimeLock, answers to the questions, which is how much Bitcoin is inside of this lockbox, and it's 0.02, and the time range, the start and the end time, and they're both given in UTC. So that means the scope is pretty much limited to the time lock mechanism only, right? We don't have to worry about the crypto so much, just attacking the time lock. So if we have a look at his website, it's pretty evident early on that the files are encrypted with the hash of the password, along with the contents of a randomly generated file. But there's no real mention of time, right? It mentions that the CPU clock is continuously checked against the Bitcoin network, but we can already kind of speculate that it's probably not going to be a part of the encryption process, right? So if we download the executable and open it up, we see this lovely old-fashioned Windows Graphics Toolkit application. We have the ability to create or edit lockboxes, as well as open them. And when we go to create them, we're asked the usual suspects like, give it the name, the file to encrypt, the password, a series of questions and answers, and the time lock range. So if we go and open this challenge lockbox, we're asked for the password and the answer, and we get this prompt. We have to wait 28 days, 1 hour, so many seconds until the data is available. That's some good information already, right? So what do attackers do when they have an unfamiliar binary? You go and dump the strings, right? And there's some pretty good ones in here, like incorrect answers. We see the prompt from before, days, hours, and seconds until the data is available, and some other good ones like select the folder where the file name will be created, or reveal the file name in Windows Explorer. They kind of sound like success messages, right? If we can try and figure out how to get that error prompt from before to flow on to these success messages, we should be able to break this right open. So if we load this into our disassembler, we can check string cross-references, right? Try and figure out where in the binary these strings are actually used. And days, hours, and seconds until the data is available is actually only used once. So we can jump there and we end up at this block of code on the right. It doesn't really matter what it does. It looks like some sort of error handling routine, but what matters is how we got here, right? So if we follow that blue line upwards, we get to this junction. So we came up to this junction from the left-hand side, right? And there's this call at the top to time 64. Well, there's another one slipped down here, but there's like an if section on this. The true path is in green and the false path is in red. And we came up from the left-hand side, which means it's the false path, right? And we were too early, which means it's probably the less than side of this if statement. The other call to time 64 has both a true path and a false path as well. One's probably going to be the time's correct, everything's all good, and one's going to be we're too late, let's revoke access. But we need to figure out what one's what. So we'll just keep checking this right-hand side, and we'll see where the other code path goes. And the true path leads to the string, select the folder where the file name will be created. And then immediately below that, we see calls to if open and if write. So we can kind of speculate already that we're kind of post-decryption, and we're at the stage we're about to write the plain text to the disk, right? Which is great. It's excellent for us, because it means the time lock mechanism in this case is pretty much a pair of if statements, right? Which really isn't all that flash from a security point of view. So how can we get around this? We could we could just patch it out, right? We could just change the conditional jumps to unconditional jumps, and just change it from JVE to jump, and we get logic more or less like this, right? So we always take the true path no matter what. So it's reverse engineering 101 mostly. So if we apply this to the executable, enter in the correct password and the answers, we get this very interesting prompt. Select the folder where the Bitcoin private key will be created, and if we want to reveal this in Windows Explorer, which we absolutely do. And we have loot number 1. We have a private key for 0.02 Bitcoins. Awesome. Magical internet money for days. So what do we learn from this? Well, if you place checks like after decryption, it's kind of far too late. It really needs to happen before decryption happens. And time in this instance is kind of a secret. It needs to be involved in the decryption process, right? Executables also can't be a root of trust. Just because something is compiled doesn't mean that it can't be modified. Attackers can easily modify binaries just like we did. And the binary is also kind of deriving its key within itself, and it really should be handled by a third party and not being done on the fly. So I went and told CryptoCommon about this, and he thought it was very intriguing that I managed to break his binary so quickly. So he went away, he made some changes, and he came up with another challenge. Now, he was still pretty confident in his product. He's still claiming that it's unhackable. He ponied up another 0.02 Bitcoin in another challenge lockbox and asked the world to give it a go. So let's do that. I asked him what changed. Now, he mentions that the data is encrypted with the TimeLock data and not just the password and answers to the questions, so that's good. And that the decrypted data must now be validated, and validation more or less implies you've got the correct time. And from this, we can kind of speculate that decryption is going to be happening no matter what, and it's going to be some sort of validation routine to make sure that decryption happened properly, and if it did, write the file of disk. Otherwise, throw up an error prompt. So we need a plan of attack. When you're reverse engineering binaries, this one's like 4.5 megabytes of 12,000 functions. You don't want to go read through all of that, right? You want to narrow down as much of that as possible. So how about we just try and locate where the time is being passed into the decryption function. If we can find it, just change it to the future and see what happens. We know what the times are, right? They're given to us as part of the challenge. So if we keep an eye out for the time, which we can change to Unix timestamp and then change that to hexadecimal, if we place the program in a debugger and we step around and we have a look at the values in registers, we could try and locate where this turns up in the registers, right? And if we see it, we're probably going to know we've got a good time to try and modify. So in this instance, I tried to open up the challenge lockboxes, and I got the prompt, incorrect answers or the current time is not within the time lock window. So that was with the correct password and correct answers to questions. I then did another round with the correct password but incorrect answers, and I got incorrect answers. So already, because we're getting 2 different error outputs, we can kind of already get some information from this. One's passing further than the other, so decryption is probably happening between these 2. If we can locate where these 2 are in the code, we can probably find a decryption function and then analyze it from there. And if you jump to cross-references in the actual code itself, each of the strings are only used once, which is very useful. So if we jump to the position of incorrect answers or the current time is not within TimeLock window, we arrive here, but of course it's just an error handling routine and it doesn't matter. What matters is how we got here. So if we just go follow that line upwards, we come to this sort of junction. This gives us a solid lower bound for where we're trying to search for this decryption function. Anything after this is just going to be error handling or writing the file of disk, so we can just completely forget about it, right? What we need now is to find an upper bound, because we're sort of doing a binary search sort of thing. So if we jump to incorrect answers, we get here, but of course it doesn't matter what this is, it matters how we got here. We arrive at this junction here, which has another clue for us, no connection to the Bitcoin network. We know we need a connection to the Bitcoin network to get the time, right? So decryption hasn't happened yet. So we've found our solid upper bound. There's only a couple blocks of assembly between these 2, so if we start analyzing that, we can probably track down the decryption function. So we can try to set up some breakpoints, right? There's a function call right before that string, the current time is not right. So I was like, okay, let's put some breakpoints either side of that function call and look at this a little bit more closely. So you open up your debugger, set some breakpoints, and we notice that a buffer is being passed into that function. If you have a look at the contents of it, it's just gobbledygook, so it's obviously an encrypted file, right? And if we step over it, we get some plain text. And I had created my own lockbox for this particular one with the time set to 5 minutes in the future just to learn how it all works. And the interesting thing here is that there's a whole bunch of zeros in this particular lockbox, right? And the zeros are actually used in a validation loop immediately below that. It just checks to see if there's zeros, and there's a counter that increments up to 40 hex, which is 64 decimal, right? And that checks to see if your lockbox actually decrypted properly, so that's good. We've located the decryption function. So if we have a look inside of it, there's a part where it loads, dereferences a memory location, and sticks the contents in REX, right? If we have a look at REX, it's 5C4, E2, C15, and that was kind of what we were looking for. It sort of fits, right? If we convert it to decimal, we get a valid Unix timestamp, right? And it was when I was actually trying to break this. I was like, okay, awesome. We found the time. So I went and opened up the challenge lockbox, and I set a breakpoint right at that position where the time was being loaded in. And I just swapped it out for a value that was just between the valid start and end times. And we go back to our initial set of breakpoints right before that decryption function is triggered. And we go and step over that encrypted buffer again, right? And this time we get plain text. We have successfully cracked challenge number 2. So if we hit resume, we get asked where we want to store the loot, and we have loot number 2. I was feeling pretty happy with this. So what did we learn from this time? Well, we managed to track down a secret pretty easily in the application itself, right? It was just there waiting for us to find it. And when I replaced it, there was no validation that happened after I'd switched it out to do a check with like the current computer time or something like that, which would have outed me as breaking it. So how do we fix this? Your secrets should really be hashed on entrance of the application, because if a reverse engineer is just sitting there in the debugger, just stepping through the program until they find it turn up, if it was hashed into something like not familiar, I probably just would have skipped it, thought it was gobbledygook, and not paid any more attention to it. Again, keys should probably also be generated, not be generated locally, but supplied by a trusted third party, which doesn't have attacker control. But I went and wrote this up to CryptoCommodicon, and he thought that was exceptionally interesting, that I managed to use strings like that to figure out where decryption was happening. And he went and fixed his program again. So I started working with him to help increase the security of his program, and he went and encrypted all the strings in his binary, or most of them, and did some other things to try and keep me out. And he put up another challenge, but this time recognizing that designing an unhackable time lock is challenging, so that's good. He again put up another 0.02 bitcoins and let the world go have at it. So I wanted something interesting, so how about we launch a cyber attack? Now, we know TimeLock has to connect to the Bitcoin network and get the time somehow, right? So why don't we just flood the network with a whole bunch of malicious nodes, Bitcoin nodes, right? They behave exactly like legitimate ones, but we're going to have their clock set to the future. We'll then disable internet access in our virtual machine, and we'll try and fool TimeLock into connecting to our fake nodes instead, and we'll see if it buys it, right? And for that, we have to figure out exactly how TimeLock connects to the Bitcoin network, right? So if we go and decrypt a lockbox, I set up a packet sniffer on Wireshark, and I noticed that there was a whole bunch of DNS requests going on. They're not normal ones either, because normal DNS requests just return one record for the IP address. But in this case, we were getting 20 or 30 different addresses. And I looked it up, and in the Bitcoin world, there's these things called seed nodes, which a Bitcoin node can connect to get more peers. And it's just a live hosts in the last 30 minutes. And it turns out that TimeLock was connecting to 5 of these, and they were hard-coded into the binary. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to control DNS somehow, right? to full TimeLock to connect to our fake nodes. So I had a look on GitHub, and I managed to find a script, a Python script, which implements the DNS protocol. I was like, fantastic. I somehow installed Python in Windows, and I set Windows to use Python as its local DNS resolver, right? It worked great, but I only returned one record, and I really want my seed node to act like an actual seed node, so I need to somehow modify the script. So I pulled up the RFC for DNS, and it turns out that you can just make the payload bigger and add more records to your packet. And then from there, I just shoved in a whole bunch of randomly generated IP addresses that started with 127, because then it points back to localhost, right? And then we get more or less a proper seed node, so I was pretty happy with that. So we control DNS now. So I went and changed the clock on the Windows machine to the future and disabled time syncing, that sort of stuff. I downloaded a copy of Bitcoin Core and ran the server. It bound to 0.0.0.0, which was all interfaces, so it would work just fine on localhost, which is awesome. And I switched off internet access, I opened up TimeLock, and I only got 5 of the 8 required connections. I was pretty gutted. But it kind of makes sense, right? Because there was only 5 hard-coded seed nodes. So we've got to figure out how to get TimeLock to connect to more. So when you're stuck, you search for strings. And luckily, CHCON had actually forgotten to encrypt, some. So when I searched for seed in the program, I got a whole bunch. And there's some useful hints like add seed node. No more than 32 seed nodes may be added, which can tell me I can have more than the 5 that we have, right? So if we can figure out how to add more seed nodes, we should be golden. So I jumped to different functions, and I eventually found 5 calls to add seed node happening right in a row, which looks pretty suspicious, right? Looks exactly what we're looking for. So to figure out how this worked, I just opened my debugger, set a breakpoint right at the start of it, and what happens is it actually decrypts a string, and it turns out to be one of those DNS entries, and then passes that into the add seed node function. So I'm like, okay, that's good. Add seed node just takes that address, looks up the IP address, connects to the Bitcoin network, and gets the time. So I thought, we've got 5 calls, right? Why don't we just do it again? We can just manipulate the flow of the application and just run through the whole section again. We could have 10 seed nodes instead of the 5 hard-coded ones, right? So I just changed the instruction pointer in my debugger from the very last instruction, put it back to the top again, and ran through it again. I had to do a little bit more work because I was checking for conflicts on the actual DNS addresses. So whenever the strings got decrypted on the second run through, I just changed like E's to D's and that sort of stuff, and it brought it. I hit resume, TimeLock went in, connected to my local DNS server, connected to my local Bitcoin node, and opened up. So we got our usual promising prompts, and we have loot number 3. Man, I was so happy. This was so satisfying. So it's starting to rain Bitcoin, which is pretty good. So what did we learn this time? We learned that DNS it can't really be trusted, right? It can be pretty easily manipulated, both on the network side and also on the host side. Executables also really can't be trusted, because if it's on an attacker-controlled machine, they can easily redirect the flow of execution to anything they want, right? Which is what we did. And there wasn't any attestation performed on connected nodes. It had very happily brought my fake node, even though it had 0 blocks and never connected to the Bitcoin network in its life, right? So how do we fix this? I mean, you could probably tunnel DNS via your own DNSSEC validating resolver. It's probably a bit overkill in this situation. CHCON actually chose to hard-code IP addresses for his next release, which I thought was a poor decision, but I couldn't think of anything better. Mostly because he wants to use this program, 30 years in the future to pass down encrypto keys to his children and stuff, and hard-coded IP addresses just aren't going to exist in that time frame. So it's still an open question. We should really validate nodes, right? Some form of attestation. In this case, Bitcoin has a blockchain which is fairly immutable, and you can verify the hashes for a long time span, right? And that's very useful. That should definitely be done. And since TimeLock is an internet-connected application, it really should just do like the basic check. Is internet connection present, or whatever the Windows API call is. If that fails and you know you don't have an internet connection, it should be an immediate red flag. I know reverse engineers can patch that out fairly easily, but it's still low cost, low effort. And you probably shouldn't pair with your local host addresses or local network addresses, right? So I summed this up and I sent this off to CryptoComicon, and he made some big changes to his program. He went and fixed up all of the strings that weren't encrypted and made them all encrypted, and he hard-coded those IP addresses in, and this time he started parsing Bitcoin block headers and verified it all up to the current time. It only took the timestamp from the latest block header, and he verifies proof of work as well. So I was like, okay, that's pretty good. But he put out another challenge Lockbox and asked the world to give it another go. So I was still game. So we need to come up with another plan of attack, because we're not going to be able to manipulate the TimeLock as easy as we did before. So let's just have a look at his crypto, right? It's a homemade encryption program. It's probably not going to be too bad. So we'll track down his encryption and decryption functions, and we'll just have a look at them. We'll look for improper use of modes, and we'll look for weak algorithms and that sort of stuff. So I resumed from a breakpoint as I was debugging his binary, and it just died. And I was like, what? This is weird. And it kind of terminated with a weird exit code of FFFFF9. So I went and looked it up as a constant in the code, and it turns out it was only used once, which is kind of telltale, right? So you jump to that location, and we end up in this little fun bit. There's a call to query performance counter alongside a call to time64 in a tight loop. Now, most malware analysts will be able to notice this as a pretty rudimentary anti-debugging measure. Basically, it just checks the delta between the clocks, and as the program's running, right, the delta's really small. But if you stop the program and then resume it at a later date, the delta's now massive, right? So the program can now see that it's been stopped, it's been resumed, it's probably being debugged by an analyst, right? In which case, you just go and terminate, which is exactly what happens with the exit process call. So I figured out where this was being called from. It was just being run on a thread. That it's pretty trivial to get rid of. You just patch out the call to create thread, right? I just shoved one into REX to say, create thread exited successfully, and the program brought it. So we're back to where we were before. We'll try to track down some encryption functions, right? So you just search for the normal things, fread, fclose, fwrite, and you have a look around and see what you can find. Eventually, I landed up in this block of assembly. Here's a function called sandwiching fread, fclose, and fwrite. So we can verify what this function call does just by putting a breakpoint in our debugger. And I created a new lockbox for this with the time set to the next 5 minutes and that sort of thing. And we can see our plain text file that we want to encrypt. If we step over that function call, we get a whole bunch of gobbledygook, right? So we've definitely found the encryption function. So let's take a look. Let's have a look what it looks like. Now, this is the whole encryption function, and it's going to be a little bit small and unreadable, but there's only two important things about this, right? The first part generates a single byte key stream. All it does is just a whole bunch of shifts and multiplies, and it generates a single byte key string, right? Key stream. And then it XORs that single byte of key stream with 1 byte of plain text, right? And then it increments the counter to the next byte of plain text, generates another key stream byte, and XORs that. So I was like, okay. I did this a couple times, and I noticed that every time the output was completely deterministic, right? It was the same every time. If you give it the same password, the same answers in the same TimeLock window, you get exactly the same outputs. But the problem is encryption's being performed by XOR, right? That means our key stream is the same every time. We could just decrypt it by XORing again, right? So we have symmetric encryption, which really isn't Flash. So let's try and exploit this. So if we pull out the ciphertext from the lockbox by going to decrypt a lockbox, put a breakpoint after fread or something like that, we can figure out what the actual data file is, the ciphertext anyway, and we can dump that to disk. We can then go and make a new lockbox, but the data file that we're going to encrypt can just have the same amount of bytes as the ciphertext, just so they're both the same size. So our key streams will be the same. And then we can just replace the dummy data with the ciphertext we dumped, right? And once we've overwritten that, we can just put it through the encryption process. And when we do that, we get plain text out at the end of it. It was awesome. So I went and transplanted that, put it into the decryption section, and once the failed decryption had happened, transplanted the plain text in and let it do its thing in processing the data, and we get the normal prompts in loop number 4. Rolling around in the Bitcoins now. What did we learn from this one? We learned that symmetric encryption means that we could pretty much bypass the decryption step entirely. Everything that we needed was within making a lockbox, right? The ability to create lockboxes means that we could launch non-plain text attacks, and it really sped up finding this vulnerability by quite a lot. And it probably wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have the ability to create, right? So how do we fix this? Well, you probably shouldn't use symmetric encryption in any of your applications. It doesn't really provide any security at all. If the secrets needed to make the keys are readily available, in which case they were given to us as part of the engagement. You probably should replace this with some sort of public-private key-based encryption scheme. And the keys should really be held onto by a trusted third party. So I went and told CryptoCommon about this, and he thought really, really hard about it, and he came up and with a 5th challenge, and he thought he'd fixed it, and he put up another 0.02 Bitcoin as bounty and told everyone to give it a go. So I was like, I was game. Let's give it a go. So the plan of attack this time. We're going to look at the crypto again. Crypto's good. We're going to see if symmetric encryption is still being used, and just look for the general weak algorithms and bad modes of encryption. So first things first, we've got to track down those encryption functions, right? Just search for fread, fwrite, fclose, and we end up with this block of assembly in the encryption function, which we can verify with just putting a breakpoint in our debugger and looking at the file that we want to encrypt. There's a whole bunch of A's, so that's good. And zooming out from there, it turns out that CryptoCommon has been busy. He doesn't just have 1 round of encryption anymore, he has 3 of them. So he reads in the plain text data, he puts into encryption round 1, which flows on into encryption round 2, which flows on into encryption round 3, and then writes it out to disk. Now, decryption is kind of the same, but in reverse. You read the ciphertext in, you pass it through decryption round 3, into round 2, into round 1, and then you verify it. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. Having a look at rounds 1 and 3, we actually find their instruction for instruction the same as the encryption function from challenge number 4. So that's great, right? We already know how to break this. We know it uses symmetric encryption, and we can even verify it just by making a test lockbox, right? And we find that it's vulnerable. So we don't have to worry about rounds 1 and 3 anymore. What we do have to worry about is round 2. So round 2, you're not going to be able to see this, but it's just a whole bunch of shifts and multiplies and other really weird things. There's even calls to like tan and square root and that sort of stuff. So it's very clearly a crypto function. And decryption is kind of much the same. It's in a different order, the constants are different. It does a whole bunch of weird shifts and multiplies and calls to like cosine and sine, and it does funny things. Encrypting stuff twice gives us gobbledygook, so it's definitely not symmetric, right? So we need a game plan for this one. The game plan is we're just going to try peel off 1 layer of encryption at a time, right? We're going to encrypt the 3rd round via symmetric encryption and get the ciphertext on the 2nd round. And then we're going to try and decrypt the 2nd round. So we'll make a new lockbox, we'll set the time to open in 5 minutes time, and we'll take that ciphertext and we'll put it into the 2nd round and we'll just decrypt it, and we're going to hope, fingers crossed, for hard-coded constants and no time variability or anything like that, right? If our wishes are granted, then we should have the ciphertext for the 1st round, which we can just encrypt again via symmetric encryption, and we should have plain text. So let's put this plan in action. We can extract the ciphertext like we did before, going to decrypt the lockbox, put a breakpoint immediately after fread, capture the initial ciphertext of a data file, dump that to disk. We can go create a new lockbox, set all the parameters to just right via the GUI, right? Go and encrypt the ciphertext that we dumped to peel off that third round of encryption. We can then take that second round ciphertext and dump it to disk, right? From there, we can go make a new lockbox, set the time to open 5 minutes in the future, but use the same, answers and passwords and that sort of stuff. And at the point where it's going to do the decryption for the second round, we can just transplant the ciphertext in and then just run it through the decryption round and just fingers crossed, right? Hard-coded constants. From there, we can just take whatever output we get. It's still going to be gobbledygook, right? Because it's a ciphertext of the first round of encryption. We can make a new lockbox, transplant it into that new encryption function, use the symmetric encryption properties, and hopefully we get plain text. Look at that, hard-coded constants in the second round. Oh man. This took me like forever, so I was very, very pleased when this happened. So you can extract it and all that other yada, 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 and we get loop number 5. So lessons learned from this one. If you have flawed rounds of encryption, like in your products, they may as well not be present at all, right? All they do is slow attackers down and not much else. Crypto with hard-coded constants is also pretty easy to get around. There's no variable secrets like time, which means that as long as I just, have the password right and that sort of thing, I can peel off that second layer of encryption no matter what. And it kind of feels to me that CHCON knew the flaws in each of these rounds of encryption, which is why he nested them within each other so he could get the properties that were helping them to actually fix the crypto. But that really isn't the case. If you nest crypto with a whole bunch of shortcomings of their own, it doesn't really work because we could just peel them off one layer at a time, right? Yeah. So how do we fix this? Again, like I mentioned many times before, we could adopt a public-private key encryption scheme, which the keys being held by a trusted third party would probably be pretty robust. So time to make the case for having hackers and dev teams. Now, CHCON kind of wanted to sell his encryption program because he spent a lot of time writing it, and that's totally fair enough, right? But he was more or less going to go in production in a week or two, and he was just looking for that final security audit. But the problem is, if you audit right at the end of development, right before you go into production, it's really not ideal, right? If attackers find a whole bunch, or security analysts or whatever, find a whole bunch of low-level flaws, there's going to be a lot of back and forth between the analyst and the developer to get these flaws fixed, and it ends up being pretty costly, right? If an analyst finds some particularly deep flaws in this program, which we kind of did, right, that's probably going to be unlikely to be fixed, especially if you're going to go into production in, say, 2 weeks' time. It's kind of too late by then, and it's kind of irresponsible to push deeply flawed code into production like that. So security really needs to be part of the development process at every single step, right? You need security during early design and architecture planning when you're trying to plan exactly how this crypto schemes are going to work, what properties you want, and then during the development phase when you choose what algorithms you're going to use. You need hackers present in the testing phase as well so they can try and trigger some of these vulnerabilities and catch anything that wasn't found during the development phase. And during the deployment and post-production care phase as well. Now, hackers are, you can train your developers to be pretty good on security front, but hackers are more or less specifically trained to think about complex interactions and generate an idea of the bigger picture when it comes to security. And they're definitely able to spot small nuances that most people wouldn't be able to catch as well. So I definitely think it's very useful to at least work alongside hackers during the entire development phase instead of just doing audits right at the end. If you're wondering, what would an actual robust TimeLock look like? I actually spent a bit of time thinking about this when I was communicating with CHCON, and I came up with this. It would probably use a client and server model. Secrets would probably just be stored on a trusted server, and data would never leave the client. So you'd have communication between the client and the server with a public-private encryption scheme. The server would have a private key, and the public key would be distributed to all the clients. I'm just going to keep on talking. So if a client wants to make a lockbox, they could, ask the person using it, what's the password, what's the answers, and they can hash that, and then they could send it up to the server, right, along with the start and stop times. Then the server can just store that hash of the password answers along with the start and stop times, and would generate a new private public key pair used specifically for this lockbox, and it would send the public key back to the client. The client would then encrypt their data using that public key and encrypt the answers with some other encryption channel, like the password, some sort of password-based encryption. And then if the client wanted to decrypt that lockbox, then they could collect, again, the password and the answers, hash that up, encrypt it with that lockbox public key, and then send it up to the server. The server then could decrypt each layer. Since we're using the specific lockbox public key, so it would be using the lockbox private key, it would know exactly what lockbox we're talking about. It can then verify the hash we sent it and check that the time was within the right place. The key of it being like a trusted remote server is that it's not within the attacker's control. The attacker cannot control that environment and can't manipulate it. So the time check is probably going to be relatively robust. And if the time's right and everything's good, it can send the private key back to the client. And the client can then just decrypt the data using that private key. I think it would be pretty robust. I wouldn't claim it to be unhackable, but I think this design would probably be pretty good for this application. Yeah. All right, I got some greets to CryptoComic-Con for making some pretty cool challenges and working with me to help secure his application and teaching me a whole lot about reverse engineering. To everyone who hangs out on the KiwiCon IRC channel during the weekdays, there's some pretty cool banter on there, and I'm Captain Yipe, if anyone was wondering. And to the NSA for making Ghidra public and free and open source software. Ghidra is, I don't know if anyone's played with it, but it's absolutely incredible. You should absolutely give it a go. The decompiler in it is out of this world. It supports so many different architectures, and it's quite literally the biggest thing to happen in reverse engineering for quite some time. So to the NSA, I very much hope that it helps with your mission to get more people interested in reverse engineering, and thank you very much for releasing that software. It's very nice. I've spent quite a bit of time in it. Just a quick about me. I'm a sustaining engineer at Canonical. I don't normally do too much reverse engineering, just my hobby. I normally fix Linux kernel gremlins and the Ubuntu kernels, but if you want to come talk to me about Linux or reversing, that would be pretty cool. Otherwise, I've written up a copy about more in-depth versions of all of these vulnerabilities present in this talk, and I've posted it to my blog. There's also some other stuff about Linux, that sort of thing, but there's my email address if you want to talk to me. But other than that, thank you for listening.